Welcome the anointed ones. History doesn't remember the silent crowd, it remembers the moment they roared. For years you walked through storms that no one admitted were happening. You were betrayed in broad daylight while the crowd looked away, as if your pain was an optical illusion. But let me tell you something chilling. Over 70% of whistleblowers face retaliation. Not for lying, but for telling the truth too early. Sound familiar? You weren't crazy. You were early. You weren't too loud. You were just too right for a world addicted to denial. And now, that same crowd that ghosted you during your crucifixion is coming back with megaphones. The silence has cracked. The dam has broken. And the people who once doubted you are now marching, not just beside you, but because of you. Let's be real, it's poetic. The same folks who once scrolled past your cries for justice are now quoting your words like gospel and acting like they always knew. Cute, right? But this isn't about petty revenge or public validation. This is about the divine backlash to years of spiritual gaslighting. This is the season where heaven says, enough. So buckle up, chosen one, because in this episode we're not whispering anymore. The crowd is rising, and this time they're loud, proud, and very late to the party you started in silence. Let's dive in. Number 1. They finally see you were never the villain. Just the mirror that made them uncomfortable. They finally see you were never the villain. Just the mirror that made them uncomfortable. People love to talk about truth until truth walks into the room wearing human skin. And that's what you were. Not a threat, not a problem, not the enemy. They just weren't ready to see themselves through you. You didn't even have to say much. Just by being you, by existing with integrity, depth, and self-awareness, you became the mirror they couldn't escape. You reflected back their hypocrisy, their jealousy, their fake kindness, their fear, and their ego-driven choices. And instead of facing what they saw, they blamed the mirror. They labeled you too much, too sensitive, too intense, or too dramatic. Not because you were, but because your presence made their masks feel too tight. You triggered something ancient in them. Truth they've been running from. You called out spiritual laziness by simply walking in purpose. You exposed manipulation by refusing to bow to it. And for a long time they played along with the lie that you were the problem, because that was easier than evolving. But time has a way of unmasking what flattery and gaslighting tried to hide. Now the very crowd that once saw you as a disruption is realizing you were a divine disruption. You were sent to provoke awakening, not chaos. And they're waking up. One by one, people are beginning to say things like, they were right all along, or I didn't understand it then, but I see it now. It's not just about you being vindicated. It's about people seeing how they participated in your crucifixion because they weren't ready to face themselves. It's about realizing the harm they caused by rejecting what was meant to help them grow. And that's why they're rising now, not just in defense of you, but in confrontation with themselves. What you represented is finally being honored, not because you changed, but because they did. And while they may never fully grasp the weight you carried or the restraint it took to endure their misunderstanding, one thing is now certain. They no longer see you as the villain. They see you as the mirror they once broke, but now need more than ever. Number 2, the same people who watched silently are now haunted by their inaction. The same people who watched silently are now haunted by their inaction. They saw what was happening to you. Maybe not every detail, but enough to know it was wrong, enough to sense the injustice, enough to feel that gut pull that said, this isn't right. But they stayed quiet. They chose comfort over courage. They chose not to get involved, not realizing that their silence was its own form of involvement. And now that silence is echoing louder than any lie ever told about you. They thought they were protecting their peace. What they really did was protect the illusion, the mask of decency that allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. While you were being isolated, slandered, broken down, or betrayed, they convinced themselves it was none of their business. But now, time has revealed everything. And that same silence they wrapped themselves in has turned into regret. You see, silence always comes with a price. And for them, the bill is due in the form of sleepless thoughts and uncomfortable flashbacks. They remember the looks you gave, the unspoken cries for help. They remember moments when they could have spoken up, defended you, reached out, but chose not to. And the guilt of that hits differently now that they see who you really were. Not the villain, not the problem, the one who was holding it together while being torn apart. They're not haunted because you failed. They're haunted because you didn't, because you rose anyway, because you healed in front of the same crowd that abandoned you, because you're still standing, not as a victim, but as a quiet storm that proved the truth doesn't need an audience to survive. Now they want to make it right. Some will speak out. Some will support you openly. Others will do it silently, too ashamed to admit how much they let you down. But one thing is certain. Their silence cost them something, and they know it. They didn't just watch you suffer. They watched themselves fail a test of loyalty, integrity, and basic humanity, and the weight of that will follow them far longer than any rumor ever did you. Number 3. Your isolation was their wake-up call, not your defeat. Your isolation was their wake-up call, not your defeat. They thought leaving you alone would break you, that by pulling away, staying silent, or pretending you didn't exist, you'd eventually crumble. They mistook your solitude for weakness. But what they didn't realize was that isolation is where chosen ones get refined, not ruined. While they were waiting for your downfall, you were getting realigned. You were shedding old versions of yourself, detoxing from their projections and reconnecting with the deepest parts of your spirit. At first, the silence was painful. You questioned everything. You wondered if you were crazy, if you really did something wrong, if maybe you deserved it. That's how deep the emotional sabotage had sunk. But something powerful started to shift. The further away they pulled, the closer you got to the truth. You realized their absence wasn't punishment, it was protection. It created space for you to see clearly, think freely, and break away from emotional manipulation disguised as love. The people who walked away thought they were taking something from you, but they were actually giving you the greatest gift: clarity. Without the noise, you saw who was real and who was just riding the wave of your light. Without the distractions, you remembered who you were before you were taught to shrink. And while they thought your silence meant surrender, you were quietly building a foundation they couldn't shake, even if they tried. Now they're starting to feel it. The crowd is waking up. They're realizing that your isolation didn't destroy you, it exposed them. It exposed how easily people can abandon what they don't understand. It exposed how quick they are to follow the majority even when it's wrong. And it exposed just how strong you really are, because you rose from a place most people don't recover from. Your isolation didn't end you. It introduced you to the version of yourself that doesn't need applause, validation, or backup. And that version, that's who the crowd is rising for now. Because the silence that once surrounded you has turned into undeniable proof. You survived what was meant to break you, and you did it without becoming bitter or small. That's power. Number 4. They mocked you publicly, but your receipts were divine and timed. They mocked you publicly, but your receipts were divine and timed. They laughed loud. They made a show out of your name. Your pain became their entertainment. They twisted your story and ran with it, confident you didn't have the power or platform to defend yourself. They told their version first, knowing people tend to believe the one who speaks loudest, not necessarily the one who speaks truth. And you? You kept quiet. Not because you were weak, but because you were being spiritually instructed to wait. You didn't need to expose them. Time was already collecting evidence. While they were busy performing, documenting their lies and creating illusions, heaven was recording everything. Every conversation, every betrayal, every false accusation was being stored, not for vengeance, but for vindication. Divine timing doesn't rush to clear your name. It waits until the silence becomes deafening, until your absence starts asking questions no one can answer. And now, the receipts are showing up, some in the form of actual proof, screenshots, messages, eyewitnesses, whistleblowers, others in the form of divine disruptions, unexplainable shifts, unexpected exposures, spiritual downloads hitting people who once judged you without mercy. The truth is no longer hiding. It's not even knocking. It's breaking through doors. People are shocked, not because you were right, but because you never fought dirty to prove it. That's what's making them rise. That's why they're rallying behind you now. You carried betrayal without broadcasting it. You endured humiliation without needing to clap back. And when the truth finally started to unfold, it was so undeniable, so eerily accurate, it couldn't be called coincidence. They didn't know the silence was part of a bigger move, that heaven had surveillance, that the Most High doesn't just protect chosen ones, He archives everything. That's what shook them. Not just the truth itself, but the precision in its delivery, the way it hit, the timing, the clarity. It's not revenge, it's divine reckoning. Now the crowd is watching the tables turn, and for once they're not just seeing your side, they're standing on it. Because what was hidden is now in plain view. And the person they once mocked, that person is now the revelation they can't unsee. Number 5. The people saw who was really throwing the stones. The people saw who was really throwing the stones. For the longest time, all eyes were on you. You were the one being picked apart, judged, whispered about, and blamed. They acted like you just couldn't take criticism or that you were overreacting. But what's coming to light now is the part they tried to bury, the beginning. The part where the attacks didn't start with you defending yourself, but with them launching silent warfare while wearing masks of righteousness. They came at you clean, smiling in your face, praying in public, quoting scripture, using spiritual language like a costume to cover up their cruelty. But behind closed doors, they were slandering you, isolating you, making others question your character while pretending to just be concerned. And because they wore the right clothes, said the right things, and had the right connections, the crowd believed them. For a while. But truth has a strange way of pushing itself to the surface, even when buried deep. And now the people who once stood on the sidelines are finally asking the right question. Who started all of this? The same ones who acted like they were trying to help are now being seen for what they really were. Manipulators, instigators, saboteurs hiding behind spiritual language and fake smiles. What shocked everyone wasn't just that the stones were being thrown, it was who was throwing them. The ones who always seemed calm. The ones who talked the loudest about grace and humility. The ones who were quickest to say, "Let's pray about it," while poisoning people behind your back. Now the masks are falling off. The crowd has turned their attention not to who cried the loudest, but to who cast the first shadow. It's no longer about damage control or let's all just move on. It's about accountability, about truth, and for the first time, people are seeing that you weren't the storm, you were the target. And the people who threw those stones, they're realizing it's not just your reputation they damage, it's their own that's now up for judgment. Number 6, you spoke softly, but reality backed your voice. You spoke softly, but reality backed your voice. You weren't loud, and you didn't need to be. You weren't out here fighting for attention or trying to convince people to see your side. You told the truth calmly, directly, without theatrics. And because you didn't scream or beg, they thought you didn't have a case. They assumed that silence meant weakness, that calm meant guilt, and that you being soft-spoken meant you could be dismissed. But truth doesn't need volume, it just needs time. While they were performing and trying to sway public opinion, you let reality do what it does best: expose. You didn't chase people down to prove your worth. You let the days, the months, the consequences, and the patterns speak for you. And now the very same events you warned about, the betrayals, the injustices, the spiritual violations, are happening in broad daylight. Everything you said would happen is now unfolding, and not in some vague or metaphorical way. It's exact. It's specific. It's undeniable. People who once brushed you off are watching your words age like prophecy. The ones who called you dramatic are now checking the timelines, replaying conversations, and realizing you weren't reacting, you were revealing. What was seen as exaggeration is now being understood as foresight. What was once called paranoia is now being recognized as perception. That's why the crowd is shifting. Not because you've changed, but because the facts caught up. Reality started matching your truth so precisely that even the ones who didn't want to believe it are being forced to reconsider. It's hard to argue with outcomes, and the outcomes are clear. You didn't win because you shouted louder. You won because you were aligned with truth. You let character, not chaos, defend you. You let consistency speak where clout used to matter. And now, even the skeptics can't help but admit, your voice might have been soft, but it was never wrong. Justice isn't just being served, it's being witnessed, in real time. And the quiet one they once ignored has become the proof they can't deny. Number 7. Your story wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. Your story wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. At first it felt like a lonely, painful, unfair journey. You kept asking, why me? As if life had chosen you for punishment. You were dealing with betrayal, isolation, and spiritual attacks that didn't make sense. People you trusted turned cold. You were misunderstood, overlooked, and cast aside by those who claimed to be godly. But what you didn't realize back then was that your story wasn't random. It was a preview, a living message, a prophetic blueprint dressed up as pain. You weren't just surviving. You were mapping out a path through spiritual warfare that others are now just starting to walk. The same patterns you faced, the fake kindness, the spiritual manipulation, the misuse of authority cloaked in religion, it's all happening to others now. But the difference is, they're not walking through it blind. They remember your story. They remember how you handled it. They remember how you got up, spoke truth, set boundaries, and didn't lose your soul in the process. People are starting to see that your journey was never just about you. You were called to walk through the fire first so that others wouldn't be consumed by it. You were sent ahead like a spiritual scout, taking the hits, learning the traps, and clearing a way for those who would come after. That's why your testimony hits differently now. It's not just inspirational, it's instructional. Your story is survival intel. People are revisiting your words, your warnings, your choices, and now they finally get it. You weren't being dramatic. You weren't imagining things. You were living in real time what they're only now starting to experience. And suddenly, the same story that made them uncomfortable before is now giving them language for their own struggle. What once felt like rejection was really divine positioning. You were ahead of the curve, a spiritual forerunner. And now, the crowd is rising not just to applaud you, but to follow your lead. Because you didn't just endure what was meant to break you, you decoded it. And now others are surviving because you were brave enough to live your story out loud. Number 8. What was done to you is happening to them. And that's why they're marching. What was done to you is happening to them. And that's why they're marching. For a long time, you looked like the outcast, the one who was too emotional, too reactive, or too sensitive. You spoke up about things others pretended weren't happening. You pointed out manipulation, gaslighting, control, and subtle cruelty in spaces that were supposed to be safe. And instead of being believed, you were pushed aside, labeled, silenced. They made you feel like you were the issue, like you were imagining it all. But now, the script has flipped, and not because you changed, but because the truth finally caught up with the crowd. They're going through what you went through. The masks have fallen in their own lives. The same tactics that nearly broke you are being used on them. The same people who weaponized kindness against you are now playing those same games in other people's lives. And this time, the manipulation isn't going unchecked. Why? Because now they know how it feels. This isn't pity. This is shared pain. They're not rising to comfort you. They're rising because they see themselves in your story now. It's one thing to hear about betrayal. It's another thing to live it. And once they felt that spiritual sting for themselves, your voice started sounding a whole lot less dramatic and a whole lot more like truth. Your story became a manual, a map. You laid the groundwork even while people were calling you delusional. You didn't just speak about survival, you showed them what survival looks like. How to heal without becoming hateful. How to set boundaries without guilt. How to hold on to your identity when everything around you is trying to erase it. Now they understand. Now they're marching. Not behind you, but with you. Because you're no longer just a name they heard rumors about. You're living proof that what tried to destroy them doesn't have to win. And they're marching because, deep down, they know the truth. You were never crazy. You were just first. Number 9. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was evidence control. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was evidence control. They were waiting for you to break. In fact, they were banking on it. They wanted you to snap, to lose control, to say something they could twist and use against you. The plan was simple: provoke you just enough to make your reaction look like the problem, while they stood back and played innocent. But you didn't fall for it. You didn't give them the outburst they could spin. You didn't give them a scene to point fingers at. Instead, you gave them silence. And that silence wasn't passive. It was strategic. You chose observation over confrontation. You watched. You listened. You took mental notes while they underestimated you. Every lie, every slight, every manipulation, you were collecting it like receipts in a folder labeled truth pending. While they were parading their version of the story, you were preparing your case, not for revenge, but for revelation. People confused your stillness for surrender, but you were never retreating. You were recording. You weren't quiet because you were scared. You were quiet because you understood the value of timing. You knew that when truth finally moves, it doesn't need to shout. It just lands. And now, that time has come. The chaos they created is now speaking louder than anything you ever said. Their lies are catching up with them. Their masks are slipping. Their contradictions are becoming public. And in contrast, your composure is exposing everything. You didn't have to expose anyone. They did it to themselves, trying to fill the silence you left behind. That's why people are listening to you now, not because you demanded it, but because your restraint became proof of who you really are. Anyone can make noise, but not everyone can sit with the truth long enough to let it speak for itself. You did. And now, your silence has turned into the loudest testimony in the room. They wanted drama. You gave them documentation. And the evidence is doing exactly what it was meant to do. Clear your name while convicting their character. Number 10. You never needed validation, but now it's coming with thunder. You never needed validation, but now it's coming with thunder. You didn't rebuild yourself for attention. You didn't heal just to prove a point. You picked up your broken pieces quietly, in dark corners no one ever bothered to check. While they were busy watching the people who knew how to fake perfection, You were doing the gritty, private work of survival. You were grieving in silence, forgiving in solitude, and growing where no one could see. No applause, no congratulations, just raw, sacred evolution. They didn't notice when you were sinking, because your pain didn't make noise. You didn't beg for sympathy. You didn't broadcast your trauma or use it as currency. You endured, not because it was easy, but because you had no other choice. And while they overlooked you, minimized you, and even mocked your silence, you kept building, brick by brick, scar by scar, lesson by lesson. Now something's shifted. The very people who ignored your fall are starting to take notice of your rise, and not because you're shouting, but because your presence is undeniable. Your growth is loud. Your glow is loud. The piece on you now has a volume all its own, and the crowd that once scrolled past your pain is now stopping to ask, how did they survive that? But here's the thing. You're not rising with bitterness. You're not looking for "I'm sorry" posts or long overdue applause. You don't need their validation, and you never did. That's what makes this moment so powerful. You weren't waiting on their approval. But now that it's coming loud, with weight, with force, with respect. People who once misunderstood you are now quoting your wisdom. They're referencing your journey. They're watching in awe, not because you demanded it, but because your evolution has become impossible to ignore. The ashes they dismissed are the very soil your purpose grew from. And now they're gathering not just to see your return, but to learn from it. You became undeniable. Not because you shouted, but because you stayed real, stayed grounded, and let your resurrection speak for itself. Number 11. Your pain became their playbook, and now they owe you respect. Your pain became their playbook, and now they owe you respect. When everything in your life was falling apart, people watched. Some did it out of curiosity, some out of judgment, and others out of quiet fascination. You were their silent entertainment, the drama, the heartbreak, the mess. They watched you lose people, opportunities, your peace of mind. And instead of helping, many leaned back and studied you like a case study. They wanted to see if you'd crumble, if you'd lose your mind, if you'd lash out or fade away. But something unexpected happened. You got back up. Not with a flashy comeback or overnight miracle, but with small, unshakable steps that built something real. You healed in front of the same people who hoped to see your failure become permanent. You showed up for yourself when no one else did. And as you rose, they took notes. Not openly, but quietly, with eyes wide open. They watched how you responded to betrayal with boundaries, how you rebuilt without revenge, how you alchemized your wounds into wisdom. What they don't want to admit is that your struggle taught them more than any self-help book ever could. They started mimicking your mindset, repeating your language, walking in paths you carved through fire. They saw your blueprint, not just the highlight reel, but the real, raw, behind-the-scenes framework that came with sweat, isolation, and sleepless nights. And now, they're walking around using what they learned from watching you, some even building success from the very wisdom they mocked when it was still dressed in your pain. They didn't just witness your struggle, they borrowed from it. They downloaded your survival tactics like silent students at a school they never acknowledged attending. And whether they say it out loud or not, they know deep down that they owe you respect. Not because you're demanding it, but because their evolution has your fingerprints all over it. You weren't just surviving, you were setting a standard. And now that they're thriving from the foundation you laid in silence, the least they can do is honor the one they quietly studied while pretending not to see. Number 12. You were the seed they tried to bury. But you became the root, holding the ground. You were the seed they tried to bury. But you became the root holding the ground. They thought they ended you. When they cut you off, smeared your name, and closed every door they could slam in your face, they assumed that would be the end of your story. They mistook silence for surrender and isolation for collapse. But what they didn't realize is that you weren't disappearing, you were developing. Underground, in places they couldn't see, you were taking root. Quietly, deeply, powerfully. While they were laughing above the surface, you were being transformed below it. Every insult watered your resilience. Every betrayal stretched your capacity. Every lonely night became a classroom, teaching you how to grow without validation, how to depend on your source instead of people, and how to build stability no storm could shake. What looked like defeat was actually depth. You were going down so you could rise up strong and stay up. Now that the fruit is starting to show, the peace, the confidence, the breakthrough, the power in your presence, the same people who overlooked you are in awe. Because you didn't come back seeking revenge. You came back rooted, steady, grounded. You became the very thing that now stabilizes others. And those who tried to bury you are realizing they didn't destroy you, they planted you. The crowd is rising now because they see the evidence. You didn't just survive, you're sustaining. Your wisdom, your story, your strength, it's feeding people, guiding them, inspiring them. They're showing up, not just to apologize, but to honor what they once ignored. They see now that while everyone else was chasing clout, you were building legacy, right beneath their feet. What they tried to silence has become the very voice holding others together. What they tried to kill has become the ground so many are now standing on. You are no longer just a survivor. You are a root system, holding the weight of people who are just beginning to understand what you endured. And they're not just watching anymore, they're watering. Because what they tried to bury has become something sacred and unstoppable. Number 13. They didn't expect you to outlive the narrative, but you rewrote it. They didn't expect you to outlive the narrative, but you rewrote it. When they lied on you, they expected the story to stick. They thought their version would become your identity. They painted you as the villain, the unstable one, the failure, the fraud. And they told it so often, with such conviction, that even people who never met you believed it. That's how confident they were that you wouldn't survive their smear campaign. They didn't just try to destroy your reputation. They tried to make your downfall a permanent headline. But you did something they didn't anticipate. You kept living. You kept healing. You kept rising. Not to prove them wrong, but to stay true to who you really are. You refused to shrink down to fit the false image they created. You didn't spend your time clapping back or chasing approval. You did something far more powerful. You let the truth unfold through your actions, your energy, and your quiet consistency. The crowd is rising now because what they're seeing doesn't match the narrative they were fed. They're watching you walk in grace when you had every right to be vengeful. They're seeing how you move with peace, not pettiness. You didn't come back seeking to ruin anyone. You came back whole. And that is what's shaking them. Anyone can be bitter. Anyone can throw dirt back. But the person who turns injustice into wisdom, the one who transforms betrayal into compassion, that person is unforgettable. You became the living contradiction to their lies. You became the sermon no preacher could give, because you're showing what true spiritual maturity looks like. Loving without losing your edge, forgiving without forgetting, elevating without announcing it. Your life is preaching in a way that exposes shallow faith, fake apologies, and performative holiness. They thought they wrote your ending, but you rewrote the whole narrative. Not with revenge, but with revelation. And now, the crowd is waking up. Not just to your truth, but to the fact that love, integrity, and divine justice still exist. You are their proof. And they're not just watching anymore. They're listening. Number 14. You were never alone. You were just ahead. You were never alone. You were just ahead. They mistook your clarity for arrogance, your urgency for aggression, your deep insights for delusion. You spoke truths that made people uncomfortable, not because they were false, but because they were too real for where they were mentally and spiritually. You felt the shifts before they happened. You named the darkness before it was popular to speak up. You saw behind masks that others were still applauding. And because you were out of sync with the crowd, they labeled you as the problem. You were never too much. You were just early. And for a while it felt like isolation, like exile. You were walking with truth in a world still invested in lies. And that kind of vision can feel like a curse when you're surrounded by people who can't or won't see. But now, everything's shifting. The very things you warned about, the patterns you pointed out, the spiritual traps you tried to highlight, they're no longer theories. They're happening to them. And that's why the crowd is rising. Not because they suddenly decided to like you, not because they woke up more compassionate, but because reality finally aligned with the truth you carried. Now that they've seen it for themselves, now that they've felt the sting of what you tried to name years ago, they finally understand you weren't alone. You were just walking the path before the map was printed. They thought your intensity was a flaw, but now they recognize it as discernment. They thought your depth was unnecessary, but now they're drowning in shallow spaces and craving what you've always carried. They didn't change their minds. They caught up. And here's the beauty of it. You're not bitter. You're not holding it over their heads. You're welcoming them into a truth you never stopped carrying, even when it cost you relationships, peace, and belonging. You didn't water yourself down to fit in, and now the world is finally rising to meet your frequency. You weren't rejected because you were wrong. You were rejected because you arrived too soon. And now, the crowd is ready to follow the path you walked alone. They thought you were finished, forgotten, and outnumbered. But what they didn't realize was that you were never out of alignment. You weren't abandoned. You were positioned. Everything they tried to bury became the very soil that strengthened your roots. And now, the proof is everywhere. You endured the slander. You outlasted the silence. You held your peace while they created chaos. And you didn't just survive the narrative. You rewrote it with grace, with depth, with God. Now, the very crowd that once looked away can no longer deny what's in front of them. They're not just witnessing your comeback. They're rising in honor of it. Not because you demanded applause, but because your life has become the evidence of what divine timing, spiritual integrity, and unshakable resilience really look like. This is bigger than being vindicated. This is about legacy, about the ripple effect of your endurance, about the fact that people are now waking up, not just to what was done to you, but to what they failed to see in you. And now they're not just rising to defend your name. They're rising because your journey made them believe again. You didn't need a crowd to be chosen. But now that the crowd is catching up, they're coming not with pity, but with power, ready to stand beside the very truth you carried alone. And that truth, it's unshakable, so walk boldly, speak clearly, and don't shrink. Because what they once mocked in isolation, they now revere in revelation. You were never too early. You were exactly on time. And now the world is rising to match the rhythm you've been walking in all along. If this message spoke to you, if you feel the power of rising above the noise and standing in your truth, then don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button right now and join a community of warriors who refuse to be silenced. Like this video to show that resilience wins. Comment below and share your story. Your voice matters, and together we rise stronger. And please, share this with anyone who needs to hear this truth today. Because when the crowd rises, it changes everything. Your breakthrough starts here. Let's rise together.